had we not started with vision, but rather had started with affect, the whole brouhaha would never have happened. Because the problem with vision is it is not an intrinsically conscious process. Well, it's not surprising that Mary could know everything there is to know about how visual information processing works without knowing anything about what it is like to see, because visual information processing can carry on perfectly well without there being anything it is like attached to those processes. We know that large parts of our visual information processing goes on unconsciously. I mean, your camera can see, but the camera isn't experiencing anything. I believe that you will never understand how the brain works if you leave out of account the fact that the brain, unlike anything else in the known universe, feels like something, and that those feelings have consequences for what the brain does. If the cortex were the seat of consciousness, then there's a very simple prediction, which is that if you remove the cortex, you should remove consciousness. What could be more straightforward than that? The part of the brain that generates feeling, called the reticular activating system, the very name points out that its absolute raison d'etre is activation. It's an arousal system. Its function is to generate feelings. Unlike the visual cortex, whose function is to process visual information. It's not necessarily to experience them. A further reason as to why that is where we should start is it turns out that visual and all other perceptual and cognitive types of consciousness are all conditional upon brainstem arousal. In other words, affective consciousness is a prerequisite for all other forms of consciousness.
The Brave Search API brings affordable developer access to an independent index of over 20 billion web pages, powered by real anonymized human page visits to filter out data and refreshed daily with tens of millions of new pages. We'll get started with 2,000 free queries monthly at brave.com/API. Professor Mark Solms, it's an absolute honor to have you on MLST. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Great pleasure to be here.
So I've really enjoyed reading your book. I've been glued to it. It's fascinating. And obviously it's very Fristonian, which is great for me because I'm a huge fan of Professor Friston. He's been on the show many times. And some people interpret Friston's work to be quite cortex-centric. And yes, I mean, I interviewed Jeff Hawkins years ago, and he has quite a kind of neocortex-centric view of things, and he disparagingly cited Paul MacLean, saying, "Oh, this guy thought that there was an old brain, and there was, it was like geological strata." Even when I read Max Bennett's book, I've got about 6 hours of interviews with him on our Patreon site, and I felt it was a little bit cortex-centric. What they generally argue is that it does planning, it does self-modeling. We can imagine ourselves doing all of these trajectories, and we can plan, and we've got intentionality and so on. And the fascinating thing is that in your book, you gave some interesting examples of people who don't have a functional cortex, and they did have intentionality. So how does that work?
Well, a word, first of all, about MacLean, who's used as some kind of straw man. MacLean's triune brain, it's a very simplistic idea, and he said so himself as he set it out. He said, look, this is hopelessly simplified, but nevertheless it's useful to think about the brain in terms of blah blah blah. So I just wanted to get that in. As to Karl Friston's cortico-centrism, I think he got over that. I think he did start out as we all did. I mean, I was schooled in exactly the same traditions. We were all taught a corticocentric view of the mammalian brain, and I don't hold that against anybody. What I am impressed by is people who, when shown the evidence, recognize, oh my word, so I better go down a few notches in terms of my understanding of where the fundamental regulatory principles of the brain emanate from. So Karl, to his credit, recognized probably from about 2016 or so onwards, he started to become much more interested in affect and much more interested in the subcortical mechanisms involved in it.
Around the time you met him at that conference.
Yes.
Do you want to tell us about that?
Well, I met him some time before the conference you're talking about. You're talking about a conference where I invited him to be the keynote speaker. That was in 2017.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I had met him, I think in 2010 or 2011 or so. I met him shortly after he co-authored an article with Robin Carhart Harris in Brain on, of all things, Freudian metapsychology. I just said something there about MacLean. I said something about Karl's or previous cortico-centrism. Now I want to address what you said about people with no cortex. Because this is really important. When I say that I don't hold it against anybody that they started out with a corticocentric view, because we were all taught this corticocentric view. What I hold against my colleagues is those who are confronted with the evidence that the corticocentric view is wrong, and they just won't, they just refuse to look at that evidence. So what you've pointed to is one of the most robust pieces of evidence that the corticocentric view of consciousness is wrong. That is, if the cortex were the seat of consciousness, then there's a very simple prediction, which is that if you remove the cortex, you should remove consciousness. What could be more straightforward than that? In terms of Popperian science, you're saying, okay, I have an hypothesis that the cortex is the seat of consciousness. That here's a falsifiable prediction. The prediction is remove cortex, you should remove consciousness. Problem is that doesn't happen. If you remove cortex, as has been done thousands of times in neonate mammals, the animal doesn't fall into a coma. In other words, it doesn't lose consciousness. It wakes up in the morning, goes to sleep at night. But much more important than that, it is emotionally responsive to its environment. So these decorticate animals play, they fight, they flee when in danger, they copulate, they raise their pups to maturity, all of this. And of course, we're talking about animals, but the same applies to human beings, that there are children who are born with a condition called hydranencephalic, which basically means a cranium filled with cerebrospinal fluid instead of a cranium filled out with cortex. They have no cortex. And just like the neonate decorticate mammals, these neonate decorticate humans, they wake up in the morning, go to sleep at night, they have seizures, they lose consciousness, but much more importantly, they are emotionally responsive to their environments. You tickle them, they giggle, you give them something that they like, they're pleased, you take it away, they're annoyed, they arch their back, they protest, you give them a fright, they startle, etc. None of which is predicted by the theory that the cortex is the seat of consciousness. The standard theory is that consciousness can be divided into two aspects. The one is its contents or qualities, and that's what the cortex provides. And the other is its sort of level or quantities, and that's what the brainstem provides. That's the standard view. In other words, if you have only a brainstem and you do not have a cortex, you should have wakefulness, a kind of blank wakefulness. You should be in a condition that we recognize in neurology as the vegetative state. In other words, which is another name for the vegetative state, non-responsive wakefulness. And that's what you predict on that theory. And yet, these kids are not non-responsive. If you forgive the double negative, they are responsive. They are emotionally responsive. So the theory is just, the prediction arising, the most basic prediction arising from the theory that the cortex is the seat of consciousness, of its contents and its qualities, is falsified. And yet people cling to it. And why they cling to it, which I think is just by dint of convention, that's why they cling to it, not on the basis of evidence. But they come up with arguments like, they say to me, but how do you know that child is conscious? It might be a philosophical zombie. Now, first of all, I have to point out that these colleagues have never interacted with these children. They say this from the point of departure of first principles. If you interact with these kids, it's like it's just like interacting with your pets. You interact with your dog or your cat, and you're telling me that's a zombie. So that they're responsive. They're playful. They're responsive in situationally appropriate ways. They respond emotionally in exactly the way that you would expect that they would, and you can sort of feel the interaction. But leaving aside that kind of appeal to what it's like to engage with these children, to get around the argument that, well, maybe these kids look as if they're feeling something, but they're actually not feeling something, you have to use other sorts of evidence. So what I particularly think is compelling evidence for the view that the brainstem is actually generating the consciousness, is that if you stimulate those brainstem structures that I'm talking about, the reticular activating system, and, by the way, also another structure called the periaqueductal gray, if you stimulate these structures electrically, there's, again, a very straightforward prediction. If all that they do is volume control, they just regulate the level of wakefulness, then if you stimulate them, you might see the patient becoming more alert or less alert, or falling into a coma or moving into a highly vigilant and aroused state. Yeah. But there shouldn't be any content or quality to what you're manipulating with the electrode. Yes. And that prediction is falsified. What you see is intense affective states. Depending on which part of the reticular activating system or PAG you stimulate, you generate a wide variety of the most intense affective states. And you see nothing like that when stimulating cortex. If you stimulate cortex, you get barely any affective responses. If you do, it's kind of like memories of affects or thoughts about affects or, abstractions about affects. You don't get the intense actual raw feelings that you do. So that's, I think, weighty evidence. The electrical stimulation evidence is weighty support for the idea that affect is actually generated by these brainstem structures.
Because you were just arguing that the reticular activating system and the PAG is the seat of arousal and therefore the seat of affect and the seat of consciousness. But you also spoke about many years ago there was a standard test in the medical world to assess if someone was conscious or not. And I was also speaking with Murray Shanahan about this because he was assessing if large language models could be seen to be conscious. And he said that Occupy, for example, that they're seen as conscious. And a lot of it is about, it's a kind of aspect. So when we share a physical space with another agent and we can kind of share information and communicate, we adopt a stance, a bit like an intentional stance. And you were just saying that when you interacted with these patients and they clearly had all of these shared behaviors, then you adopted a stance that they were conscious. But there's an interesting juxtaposition between shared behavior and their actual experience. But maybe you could just talk to that.
Yes, I think that the assumption of conscious other minds on the basis of our everyday interaction with them is, of course, the currency that we use in our ordinary lives. I assume you're conscious on the basis that you've just described. And so do I when I play with my Labradors, and so do I when I play with my children even before they could speak, and so on. But I'm perfectly ready to accept that that's not enough of an evidential base for a scientist or a philosopher to say, therefore we can conclude because I feel that this guy's conscious, therefore he is. I mean, I intuit that you are conscious. Everything that you do is consistent with the assumption that you're conscious. We need more than that, and so it's important to point out that we are providing more than that. I'm not saying when I play with those decorticated kids, if I can call them that in order to make the connection with the animal equivalent, everything they do is consistent with the assumption that they're conscious, but that's not enough. They can't report what's on their minds. And so I accept when my colleagues say, well, you don't know, they can't tell you what they're experiencing. And by the way, reportability, I think, is the worst criterion. It's ridiculous, I can get the simplest artificial agent to report that it is feeling something when it's not. I mean, reporting means nothing. But this is what my colleagues say. They say these children have no cortex and therefore can't tell us what it's like to be them, so there might be nothing it's like to be them. That's why I say, well, then let's use other methods. So I say, okay, well, if let's take somebody who's got perfectly intact cortex and let's stimulate their reticular activating system. And let's see what I predict they will report an intense affect with their cortex. It's not because I've stimulated their cortex, I've stimulated their reticular activating system. And so what I predicted would happen on my theory is what happens. I mean, that's just ordinary science. We can't set a higher bar for the science of consciousness than for anything else in nature. Yeah. But then another method, I say, let's image the brain of people who are in intense emotional states. I'm using positron emission tomography, which is the right method to image over a period of time the evolving feeling. And I predict that if you image somebody who's in an intense state of rage or fear or whatever, and this has been done, that what you will see is activation in the subcortical and brainstem structures and not in the cortex. And that's what you see. So there's another method that suggests, well, when you're in an intense emotional state, the brain the metabolic turnover in the neurons that correlates with that state is all subcortical. Then you take pharmacological probes. The reticular activating system is the source of some neurotransmitters that are very well known: serotonin, dopamine, noradrenaline, acetylcholine, histamine. These brain chemicals are sourced in the reticular activating system. And the reason that they're very well known is because they're the sorts of chemicals that psychiatrists tinker with on a daily basis. Antipsychotics block dopamine. Antidepressants boost serotonin. Anti-anxiety drugs block noradrenaline, and so on. So if all these chemicals did was switch on the lights or regulate volume control, then maybe anaesthetists would be tinkering with them in terms of trying to, manipulate the level of consciousness. But no, psychiatrists tinker with them because they modulate affective qualities of consciousness. So if you put all of this together, what happens when you damage cortex as opposed to when you damage brainstem. By the way, I should add that the smallest area of damage that's needed to produce a coma in a human being is 2 cubic millimeters, the size of a match head, in a part of the reticular activating system called the parabrachial complex. So, I mean, that by itself is really, I think, amazing evidence for the role of these structures in consciousness, but perhaps not affective consciousness. So you take the lesion evidence, you take the deep brain stimulation evidence, you take the functional brain imaging evidence, you take the pharmacological probe evidence, and you put it all together, the weight of the evidence for the view that affective feeling is generated in the brainstem is just overwhelming.
Yes. Would you mind just introducing the book? And in particular, could you start with the story of your brother?
The story of my brother is the story of where I believe my interest in the brain began. My brother and I were playing in a yacht clubhouse while our parents were yachting. And my brother clambered up onto the roof of the clubhouse and tripped and fell 3 floors onto his head on the pavement below and sustained a significant brain injury. He was flown, because we lived in a small village, he was flown to the nearest city where he was well looked after by the neurosurgeons. Actually, I must say, as an aside, unbelievably, the neurosurgery department that he was treated in was located in the exact building where my office is today, in Cape Town. Anyway, he came back home, looked the same. His name was Lee. His name is Lee. He's still alive. he looked the same apart from the fact that he now had to wear a helmet to protect his fractured skull. But he was not the same person. That was this uncanny experience of relating to my brother, who outwardly was clearly still the same person, but inwardly clearly was not the same person. And somewhere in the chaos of all of that, it gradually became understandable to me that this was due to damage to your brain. That you somehow are your brain. Was what the inevitable kind of conclusion is. But even for us adults who are steeped in the study of this question of the relationship between mind and brain, it's still a kind of a profound mystery. But to a 5-year-old, it was like, wow, I just don't. How can that be? And then I sort of drew the further inference that if my brother is his brain, then I too am my brain. And it doesn't take, even for a 5-year-old, it doesn't take many further steps of logic to deduce that you are mortal, and that since the body is mortal, if you are your body, then it's all going to end badly for you. I mean, it was a depressing business what had happened to my brother. It had all kinds of repercussions for the entire family for years to come. But this other implication of what had happened, this kind of me beginning to grapple with the facts of life, as it were, it ended up with me feeling pretty depressed. And so I remember I must have been 6 years old. I remember being so depressed that I couldn't muster the energy to put my shoes on and go to school in the morning. It just seemed like, what's the point? Everything ends in nothingness. No matter what you do, it ends in nothingness.
You said something interesting about the mind and the brain. And this is something that I've thought a lot about over the years as well. Actually, in one of the chapters in your book, you said the first time you cut into the brain that you were cutting into the mind. And neuroscientists tend to think that the two are one in the same. And there are different perspectives, like, for example, dualists might appeal to another ontological substrate, or externalists might appeal to some kind of wider diffusion, and we just kind of conceptualize the mind as being in the brain. So your book was quite brain-centric, but could you reflect on that?
Well, I must say, first of all, that I'm not a philosopher. I'm a neuroscientist first and foremost. And nevertheless, I think that if you're a neuroscientist, especially if you're a neuropsychologist, in other words, that branch of neuroscience which deals with the relationship between mind and brain, then you have to, at some point, I mean, you're in real trouble if you don't realize that at some point you have to come to a position on this metaphysical question of the relationship between the two. And it is ultimately just a position, of course. We can all trot out our positions, and who's to say who's right? But I mention the fact that I'm not a philosopher because I came to the position that I did in my own rough and ready way. I struggled through it in my own mind, not scholastically, but rather personally. And the conclusion I came to, which I thought was my own unique solution to the problem, turned out to be, of course, a well-worn path to that solution, and going all the way back to Spinoza, because the solution I came to turns out to be dual aspect monist sort of view.
Yes.
And so, just to not be too abstruse about it, let me just be clear what I mean by that. What I mean by that is, when I wake up in the morning with my eyes still closed and I experience my existence, I am Mark Solms, thank God I still exist. That's my mind. What else can you call that than mental experience? That thought process in the privacy of your own consciousness as you awaken in the morning. Then you stagger over to the bathroom and you look in the mirror and you see this body staring at you, and you recognize that too is Mark Solms. that thing over there, that object, and the subject of Mark Solms that you experienced yourself to be when you woke up clearly are one and the same thing. There can't be two Mark Solmses. That thing is Mark Solms. This thing is Mark Solms. So we must be one and the same. And so it leads me to what I think is a pretty commonsensical conclusion, that these must be two different observational perspectives upon the same part of nature, called Mark Solms. Mark Solms observed from the outside, and Mark Solms observed from the inside. That was the conclusion I came to. So to me, that really is... I recognize that, philosophers are very clever people, and they have all sorts of concepts and historical precedents that they plow through in order to come to the positions that they do. But for me, it's just, I don't see how it can be otherwise. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But I do recognize that leads to a big question. If the subjective experience of being Mark Solms and the objective perception of the body of Mark Solms are just appearances, are just perspectives upon one underlying ontological entity, it raises the question, well, what is that entity made of then? If it's not bodily stuff, physiological, anatomical stuff, and it's not mental, experiential stuff, then what is the underlying entity that generates or that appears in these two forms? And the conclusion that I came to on that score is that it is ultimately an abstraction. I mean, it's in the nature of what lies behind appearances that it's not phenomenal. You can't say what it is. You can only infer what it is. You can't see what it is. You can't perceive what it is. You can't touch what it is. But you can infer from the behavior of both manifestations, the physiological behavior of the organism and the subjective experience of that same organism. You can infer the underlying regularities that generate this sort of behavior, subjective and objective behavior. So the underlying entity is an inferred set of functional, causal energies and forces interacting with each other to produce these behaviors. That the inference of what that underlying functional system is also requires us to explain, with reference to the inferences that we make about how that system works and so on, why it has two appearances. Why must there be something it's like to be such a system? Why does it have a subjective aspect? But I want to conclude what I'm saying here, because I realize I'm rambling a bit. I want to just make sure that it's not as abstract and obscure as it might seem. What I'm saying is just a generalization from an observation like the following. You can have a memory, that's the experience, that frightening thing that happened. I'm re-experiencing it now. That's a mental experience of a memory, having a memory. Or you can look, say, with the modern optogenetic technology, you can see the memory trace activated. In this instance, a fear memory. You can sort of see the concatenation of neurons that constitute physiologically and anatomically that same thing, that same memory. Yeah. So you have two appearances. You have the subjective reminiscence, that thing that happened, and you have the objective neural events, those things that are happening. Clearly, these are the same things. Yeah. So what underlies both of those things is an abstraction called memory. You can have a memory and you can see a memory trace, but the function of memory is an abstract. The memory systems we speak of in cognitive science. And we try to discern the laws governing those systems. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about when I speak of the underlying entity. It's something like the memory systems, the executive systems, the perceptual systems, etc. And you can speak likewise of the respiratory system, the digestive system, etc. These are functional systems that regulate the behavior of the organism.
It's interesting, Mark, that you said you're not a philosopher, because I think you rather are. I really loved reading your exposition of other people's ideas and philosophies, because I've spent many years trying to understand them myself, and your exposition of the free energy principle, of the hard problem, of Nagel's problem, the mind-body problem, other theories of consciousness. I felt that you exposited it extremely clearly, and the Chalmers thing is quite interesting as well. So I was just reading your chapter on the hard problem, and as I understand it from reading your chapter, he's arguing almost that the fundamental substrate of the universe is information. So he's making an ontological argument about information. And Karl Friston, with the free energy principle, he's a physicist, he's a materialist. So he's arguing that information is epistemology, it's knowledge. Whereas Chalmers is saying the fundamental substrate is information. And then you have phenomenal aspects and you have material aspects, which leads to this idea that certain structures and organizations of information, could lead to conscious experiences. And that's distinct from panpsychism, because panpsychists presumably think that there's little bits of consciousness everywhere. But to Chalmers, whether it's in a computer or in a brain, if you have certain causal structures and functional organization, there would be consciousness. But how would you kind of contrast your view with that?
First of all, thank you for complimenting me on my clarity on these philosophical questions. I think that it's the clarity that comes from amateurism. In other words, you don't get lost in all of the arcana that you don't even know about. That said, I want to preface my answer to your question about Chalmers by clarifying that there are two aspects to his famous coined the notion of the hard problem as opposed to the easy problem. The first half of the paper is articulating the problem. The second half of the paper is his attempt at a solution to the problem.
Yes.
And please note, because this is important to recognize nowadays, that Chalmers did not think the problem is insoluble. And many people now claim, well, this is a metaphysical problem. There's no answer to it. Don't be silly. But, Chalmers himself attempted to answer it. So what you're talking about is his attempt at an answer.
Yes.
Having articulated the problem, he then says, this is not insoluble. Here's an example of how we might answer it. And you've just summarized very well what his view is. And you also put your finger on the nub of the matter when you speak about the difference between an ontological and an epistemological notion of what information is. Chalmers writes in that attempt at a solution that there's an underlying thing called information, which has two appearances. The one is phenomenological and the other is physical. That's a strange idea, a strange way of thinking about information. I mean, if you go back, for example, to the beginning of the whole matter as far as information science is concerned, you go back to Claude Shannon's paper, in which he first introduces a quantifiable physical notion of information into science. The title of the paper refers to a mathematical theory of communication.
Yeah.
So that's at the heart of the concept of information. It's a message that is passed, a message that is received from an information source. And so there's a relationship between the subject who's asking a question of the universe and the answer that it gets back. So information is a matter of questioning, questions and answers. It's not an objective thing. I mean, information doesn't just sit there. It's information for me. So the very same physical structure carries different information for me than it does for another observer, depending upon what sorts of knowledge we bring to it, prior knowledge I might know a lot more about that system, in which case it carries very little information for me in terms of what I can learn from it that I don't already know, whereas somebody else who's encountering this system for the first time, it carries an enormous amount of information because, they've never encountered it before. So they will have to ask many more questions before they will have an understanding, a knowledge of the system. And I'm very sympathetic, by the way, with the idea that information is a good concept to use in terms of trying to straddle the divide between subjective experience, in other words, mental stuff, and physiological neural events. Information is a pretty good candidate for, looking for some underlying process which you can abstract from both observational perspectives. This is all about information processing. It's all about the passing of messages. And for me, what that leads to, given what I've just said to you about information being communication, information being a matter of questions and answers, it's a relationship between a asker rather, and an information source.
Yes.
It leads to the question, well, what sort of system asks questions? Where does question asking arise from? Why is there a need to engage with your surrounds and ask questions of it in order to gain information? Where does the imperative to acquire information come from? So it's not information itself that is the fundamental stuff, but the relation or the nature of the system that gives rise to it needing to ask questions. That I think is the essential nature of the thing that underlies mental life and brain processing, is a thing that needs to ask questions. It needs to process information, in other words. So when I look at these information flow charts, which I learnt about in the 1980s when I first studied neuroscience, even then it occurred to me, I would see this like Fellerman and Van Essen, very impressive, there it goes from the retina, boom, 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 through hippocampus, boom, 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 ultimately ends up in prefrontal cortex, all this information. And then I ask myself, but where's the subject that receives all this information? Who is this information being communicated to? So those flowcharts look like what Chalmers is talking about. It's this thing, this sort of objective, abstract thing called information. Whereas information, as I say, really entails a relationship between a subject and an object.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's quite ironic, actually, because I was reading Chalmers' book, Reality Plus, and he always cites John Wheeler and it from bit, but from the ontological point of view, not from the information exchange point of view. And we'll go on to talk about Fristonian ideas in a minute, but of course, the information exchange and entropy is built into his very formalism, which is fascinating. But we should just...
But John Wheeler exactly illustrates the point that I'm talking about.
Yes.
I mean, Wheeler's whole participatory interpretation of the universe is, there's an active participant who is extracting information from the universe, and so it's that relation that I was talking about.
Exactly, but I think Chalmers cites him to make the ontological argument rather that but actually the information exchange is the important thing. But just before we move on from the hard problem, because I think that's really interesting. So yes, I put forward Chalmers' less known ideas around, I think it's called structuralist, computationalism, or kind of specialized functionalism, which is this idea that any system, any physical system with certain types of information processing could lead to minds. But the hard problem itself is pretty much the same thing as the mind-body problem, which is this idea that why is it the case that you have certain patterns of activation in our brains, or you even divided it into two things. So you said we see visual information and we have a visual experience, or maybe we also feel psychological states as well. So I feel pain, I feel anger, and why and how does that arise? The what is it likeness? What's your take on that?
What is my take on why is there something it is like to see?
Well, I mean, maybe we should start with we'll come back to the foreplay in a minute, but I think that the climax of your argument is that, consciousness is feeling, it is affect. And we can explain why consciousness arises from affect because it's our way of sense making and, it's the source of our volitional behavior. So if we can explain consciousness, then there is no hard problem of consciousness because we've got a physical, mechanical explanation, exactly what Sigmund Freud always, argued that we should have. So you're kind of making the argument that there is no hard problem of consciousness.
So, you've got this disarming way of asking questions which look like very simple and straightforward questions, but they're jam-packed with layers of sub content. So, let me start by saying, yes, I think had we started approaching the problem of consciousness a la Chalmers, and indeed a la Francis Crick, whose notorious book, The Astonishing Hypothesis, came out the year before Chalmers's pouring cold water on the whole exercise. So Crick started with this idea: what we need to do now is solve the mind-body problem scientifically. This is not a metaphysical question anymore. All we need to do is identify the neural correlate of consciousness. So let's try to identify the neural correlate of visual consciousness, and then we can generalize from there. That was Crick's strategy. And what I was saying is that I think that had we not started with vision, but rather had started with affect, the whole brouhaha would never have happened. Because the problem with vision is it is not an intrinsically conscious process. The famous, knowledge argument of Frank Jackson, yes, which I don't need to spell out. I'm sure that everyone is familiar, or is everyone not familiar with that?
Well, Philip Goff explains it on an episode we're about to release. I mean, maybe just in a couple of sentences. But
okay. Yeah. Well, I like to simplify it. So my simplified version of the knowledge argument is that there's this imaginary visual neuroscientist named Mary, and she knows, that's the knowledge, she knows everything there is to know about the physics and physiology and anatomy and information science of vision, but this is my simplification, but she's blind. So although Mary knows everything about the functional causal mechanisms of visual processing, she's never experienced what it is like to see. So now one day, thanks be to God, the gift of sight is bestowed on Mary, and Jackson's point is, at that moment, she learns something utterly new about vision, namely what it's like to experience redness and greenness and contrast and, light and dark and so on. None of these things had she ever experienced, and everything she knew about the functional mechanisms of vision neither prepared her for what it is like to see, nor even made it necessary for her to understand that there must be something it is like to see. It seems as if the causal mechanistic account of visual information processing has no place for the experiential phenomenal stuff of seeing, of experiencing visual qualia. So that was the argument. And I'm saying, well, it's not surprising that Mary could know everything there is to know about how visual information processing works without knowing anything about what it is like to see, because visual information processing can carry on perfectly well without there being anything it is like attached to those processes. There is not necessarily something it is like to see. Not only do we human beings and all other creatures that have a visual system, we know that large parts of our visual information processing goes on unconsciously. For example, the projection from the retina down to the superior colliculi in the brainstem of us humans. There's plenty of visual information processing going on down there, but there's no phenomenal feel that corresponds to it. So, and not only in us humans or other visually endowed creatures, I mean, your camera can see. It's processing visual information. It's got photoreceptors that activate information processing pathways, which leads to the laying down in some substrate of a reproducible visual image, but the camera isn't experiencing anything. I mean, even your phone can process visual information. So there's nothing intrinsically experiential about vision. So what I'm arguing is we started in the wrong place. This is what led us to that impasse. You can know everything that there is to know about visual information processing, but it doesn't explain to you why there's something it's like to see.
But even that's interesting, though, because Chalmers making the argument that language models are consciousness is every bit as absurd as us making the argument that the camera can see. So the camera performs the function, the abstract function of vision, but it's not an agent in the world as we are.
Yeah.
But I wanted to touch on, Murray Shanahan said there's a difference between capital S subjectivity and lowercase s subjectivity. So the Chinese room argument and the knowledge argument, they are basically this epistemology versus ontology thing, So the what is it like to see that colour or to experience laughter if it's John Searle in the room. But I quite like the lowercase s subjectivity, because you could just make the case that, as Friston does and as you do when you have this affective version of the free energy principle, that, when the generative model contains phenomenal states and essentially you have the knowledge in the system, that's kind of lowercase subjectivity, because we're still materialists, we're still containing everything in this physically, causally closed world, but we now have the phenomenal information in the system.
Yes, I think that in order for people to understand why you're saying what you're saying, I need to spell out a little bit more of my own argument, because I've just been saying why I don't think that visual information processing is the right place to start, or the function that we call vision is the right place to start for using it as a model example for how consciousness arises. I think that the right place to start is with affect, and there are two reasons for that. Before I proceed, let me just say affect is a word that means different things to different people. Yes. So let me explain what I mean by affect. I mean feeling, okay? I mean this thing that we experience, which has a goodness and a badness to it, always. There's a valence to feeling, and there's a qualitatively distinct category of feeling. So hunger is different from thirst, is different from sleepiness, is different from pain, but all of them have an unpleasant valence. So that's what I mean by feeling. And feelings are necessarily, this is the first reason why I think it's the right place to start. Feelings are necessarily felt. Yep. You can't, it's an oxymoron to speak of an unconscious feeling. If you don't feel it, it isn't a feeling. So that's a good place to start. If we're wanting to understand what the causal mechanism is of consciousness, let's start with its most elementary form, which is feeling, and let's try to account for that functionally. And now, please note, if you try to do that with feeling, and if Mary were an affective neuroscientist, and she knows everything there is to know about the causal functional mechanisms whereby feelings are generated, she would have to know that they feel like something. Yes. It's intrinsic to the function of feeling that you feel it. And she would also, her mechanistic account would necessarily predict that it has valence, because that's the essence of what feeling is, and that it has categorical qualities, and that these are subjectively experienced by the organism and so on. All of that is intrinsic to what we mean by. So when Chalmers says there's no cognitive function that you can say in advance that a causal functional mechanistic account of that function will explain why you experience it, I'm saying yes, there is. It's not a cognitive function, it's an affective function. The function of feeling, if you give me a mechanistic account of how feeling arises, you will necessarily have given me a mechanistic account of how phenomenal qualia arise, because it's in the essence of a feeling that it is a phenomenally experienced quale.
Yes, indeed, and it's very intuitive. I really enjoyed reading your commentary on this, and essentially you're arguing, if you can imagine the Venn diagram of feelings, and you went through the feeling system broadly as well. So there's like lust, for example, and grief and anger, and all of these kind of sensations that evolution has gifted us. You use the word gifted because they have served us very well, even though not quite as well in the modern world as you say, but But the really interesting thing, though, is when we sort of slowly introduced the free energy principle, you said that the reason we are consciously aware of things is because it's to do with prediction errors and empirical learning. And this is completely intuitive to anyone. So I'm learning how to drive a car. And at the very beginning, I'm consciously aware of everything. And that's because there are so many prediction errors. My brain hasn't learned how to navigate the world yet, so I'm consciously aware of it. And there's this beautiful kind of spectrum between, autonomy and automation. So when the brain needs to it needs the conscious system for us to learn about the world, then we are conscious of things. And the affect systems seem to be, because the brain wants to be efficient, right? The brain doesn't want to give us consciousness, but it has to give us consciousness because we wouldn't be able to survive in the world without it. But the thing that fascinates me is like all of our cognitive functions and the reason we've landed on the moon and the reason we do all of these intellectual things, they all derive from our affect system. So if we were affectively dead, we wouldn't have this rich cognitive system.
All of what you've just said, of course, I completely agree with. I want to make sure that our viewers are seeing the intermediary steps.
Yeah.
So I want to just stick with this idea that feeling, is the right model example of consciousness rather than vision. And I've said why in kind of logical terms, that it's oxymoronic to speak of an unconscious feeling. But I want to go further than that and point out that the part of the brain that generates feeling is called the reticular activating system. The very name points out that its absolute raison d'etre is activation. It's an arousal system. Its function is to generate feelings. Unlike the visual cortex, whose function is to process visual information. It's not necessarily to experience them. So, and most visual information processing goes on in the dark. But arousal and activation, this is what it's for. So that's another reason why I think that's where we should start. A further reason as to why that is where we should start is it turns out that visual and all other perceptual and cognitive types of consciousness are all conditional upon brainstem arousal. In other words, affective consciousness is a prerequisite for all other forms of consciousness. So I need to make sure that our viewers understand that this is not some arbitrary sort of system Mark Solms came up with. Oh, let's make it work this way. It's kind of a pretty systematic. You kind of led naturally to the conclusion. Okay, feeling seems to be where we should be studying if we want to understand in natural scientific terms what consciousness is for, how it arises, what it does. It's the elementary form, feeling, the foundational form, the fundamental form, the rudimentary form. That's where we should start. Now we come to what you are saying about Friston and the free energy principle and prediction errors and all of that. When we look into the brainstem mechanisms that I'm referring to and look at how and why arousal is generated in the brain, we learn that it is a manifestation of the fundamental biological principle of homeostasis. That homeostasis, if we are in homeostasis, we function like zombies. That automatism that you referred to, it is in fact perfection itself as far as a biological system is concerned. I'm in my viable bounds. That's all I need to be. If I'm outside of my viable bounds, then I'm in trouble. I'm not where I expect to be. I'm not where my phenotype is designed to be. This is a surprise. This is a homeostatic deviation. And it's these deviations from homeostasis that give rise to the arousal states that we call feeling. So feeling is just the organism registering, oh shit, things are going wrong. And then that's negative feeling, unpleasant feelings. Yes. And pleasant feelings are the opposite. Okay, things are going right. I'm heading back in the right direction, back towards my viable bounds. So I mean, I want to really I don't want to rush this, but I think that it's very important that people understand it's an extremely simple and straightforward idea that there is a value system built into all biological systems. That is, it's good to survive and bad to die. Okay.
Friston argues that there's a physics of intelligence,
Yes.
and he uses the terminology non-steady state equilibrium. And one of our Discord guys, Dan, he said to me he watched your interview with Lisa Feldman Barrett, and apparently, is it true that you've now been using the word allostasis rather than homeostasis as well, as a bit of a specialization? But the reason I brought this up though is that in the physical world, even though it might be a kind of instrumental fiction, because a system needs to maintain its integrity, and we use the word survival mechanism or survival imperative. But then in the world of psychology, we use affect, like lust and desire and so on. So how do we bridge the world from the really simple physical world to this much more sophisticated form of homeostasis?
Well, just as an aside, homeostasis and allostasis are two sides of the same coin. Yep. So, it's not that I am now using the term allostasis. Allostasis is just what the organism does in order to maintain homeostasis. So that's not a major issue. Yes, to come back to what you've just said, it begins with the fact that living organisms are self-organizing systems. That's what they are. They are, every living thing is a self-organizing system. Not every self-organizing system is a living thing. And that's interesting. I think that, there we have the link between life sciences and the other natural sciences, that the principle of self-organization, I think, is a very good way to get from what existed prior to life that gave rise to life. How can we explain life in terms of the ingredients that were there before its emergence? And I think the same can be said, how do we shift from life to sentient life? That it's self-organizing systems, in other words, systems which have necessarily a perspective upon the world. A self-organizing system must differentiate itself from its environment in order to maintain its own existence. It can't disperse and just equalize with the environment. It has to maintain its separate being. And this gives it a point of view, and what is more, it gives it a point of view which has existential properties. It is, I'm translating it into words, but the system doesn't think in words. The system simply functions this way. As a self-organizing system necessarily does whatever is necessary to continue to exist as a system. There already you have a value system. It's good to continue to exist. That is measurable. Deviations from my likelihood to continue to exist is just what Karl Friston calls free energy. It's the extent to which my free energy is rising is the extent to which I'm unlikely to continue to exist as a system. So I think it's very important that there's subjective value attaches to free energy. From the point of view of the system, and only from the point of view of the system, increasing free energy is bad. It's not bad for the universe, it's bad for me. And this is the basis of affect. Affect is how a system registers how well or badly things are going for it in relation to its imperative to minimize its free energy, but not free energy as a continuous variable, a free energy in relation to the multiple needs of the system. So that's a crucial point, that a system that has feeling doesn't only have to minimize a quantity called free energy. 8 out of 10 of sleepiness and 8 out of 10 of thirst, you can't just add them together and say, okay, it's 16 out of 20 of free energy, so let's sleep. And that'll be fine because you will have minimized the quantity. You'll die if you do that because you need to drink too. So this is the thing I'm referring to, that the sort of system that must feel is a system which is striving to continue to exist, as all self-organizing systems do, and has multiple categories of need that it has to satisfy in order to continue to exist, which means that it has a subjective point of view, which has existential value attached to it, which necessarily means there's a goodness and badness to its subjective states that it's registering and must register in order to continue to exist. And crucially, those subjective states have to be qualitative because they pertain to categorical variables. 8 out of 10 of sleepiness is not the same thing as 8 out of 10 of thirst. So what I've described there in perfectly ordinary, natural, scientific, mechanistic terms is what kind of system must have feelings. So that's the point that I was, in relation to what you were saying. Now, one last thing I want to add to that is that what is added because of course there are many organisms that function purely reflexively, that they have homeostates, many homeostatic imperatives, and whenever they're moving out of homeostasis, they do something to return to homeostasis, but it's always the same thing. It's entirely stereotyped. What feeling adds is that when your reflex or instinctual response to homeostatic error signals does not succeed in bringing you back to where you need to be, then this is where the allostasis you referred to earlier comes in. Then what does the organism do? Well, it dies because it doesn't have in its behavioral repertoire how to deal with this unpredicted situation. So feeling enables the system to navigate unpredicted environments. In other words, to manage uncertainty. Normally I have a reflex which says, when I move out of my viable blood gas range, and I breathe in, that gives me oxygen. I breathe out carbon dioxide. Breathe in, oxygen. Breathe out carbon dioxide. Great. This way, I survive. But what if you're in a carbon dioxide filled room? Now, you're not in this situation, not in the environment that's predicted by your reflex. So it doesn't work. When you breathe in, you don't breathe in oxygen, you breathe in carbon dioxide. So now you're in a state of uncertainty. What do I do? Feeling enables you to determine whether, if I decide I'm going to go upstairs, in the stochastic behavior that arises from this uncertainty, I go upstairs and I find the feeling is that it's harder to breathe there. There's less oxygen there and so the suffocation alarm feels worse. I then change my mind and go downstairs, and there I feel it's better. So feeling enables the organism to make choices. It underwrites voluntary behavior as opposed to automatic behavior. Yes. And that's the functionality that feeling bestows. That's what feeling adds. That's what it's for.
Yes, and I must admit I'm rather convinced by the link between voluntary behaviour and affect. I think that's very interesting. But just to stretch it out a bit more, let's imagine it was carbon monoxide in the room below, so your suffocation alarm didn't go off if you were sleeping. And you've spoken about the interesting relationship, because obviously you're not a fan of the cortical approach to consciousness, of course, as that was one of the mistakes that Sigmund Freud meant. But there is still an interesting interaction with our cortical system. So, for example, our feeling systems, they're a base template, and they can still be adapted. So I can learn on the internet that carbon monoxide is bad. I can install a carbon monoxide alarm, and then there's this kind of Pavlovian effect that when the alarm goes off, I now have panic and I get the hell out of there. So evolution has kind of created all of this neurocircuitry, and we have peptides and hormones. We've got things like acetylcholine and dopamine and serotonin and all of these things. But there's still a base structure which can be adapted with our cortical system. But there's also a system outside of us as well. We have the internet, we have society, we have various forms of interacting with each other, because we're a whole big system. It's not just us. So how does that all fit together?
Well, when I say, as I do, that we should start at the bottom, we should start with the most rudimentary consciousness generating mechanisms, and then build our way up from there in order to comprehend consciousness. I'm saying we shouldn't start with its most complex human reflective cognitive forms. We should start with its most elementary affective simple forms. When I say that, I'm not saying that the more complex forms do nothing, and that I'm happy to forego my more complex forms. No way. I want to have my cortex, and I'm very grateful to be able to utilize it in order to do exactly the sort of thing that you've just said. There are things that are not given by our constitutional homeostatic affect regulating systems. And there are many, by the way, homeostatic mechanisms at work in the human organism that never become to consciousness, like, for example, blood pressure regulation. It's a clinically notorious example. You don't know that you're out of homeostasis in terms of that until it's too late. Affective consciousness is not a panacea. It's a bloody powerful thing, but it doesn't deal with everything. And exactly as you've just said, so we can learn cognitively, consciously, intellectually about the world via the internet. I think you said, if we want to, we can learn about carbon monoxide, and we can learn, what to do in those situations on a purely cognitive basis, and thank God for that. And then we will survive in situations we otherwise might not have. So I'm not saying the cortex doesn't add anything. I'm not saying that sort of cognition and the consciousness that attaches to it is unimportant. I'm just saying it's not the foundation. And if you start up there, you're going to lose sight of what the fundamental principle is, because all of that higher cognition ultimately is in the service of the same basic homeostatic imperative.
Have you prescribed SSRIs in the past, or dopaminergics or cholinergics? I mean, I've experimented with cholinergics like racetams and nicotine. And so there's an interesting question there about the extent to which it knocks you out of homeostasis. But you can also bring in Sigmund Freud, of course, was studying dreams of patients. And many of those, I mean, especially the acetylcholine system affects dreaming. And you said that Sigmund Freud was right about so many things. Even though it was over 100 years ago, he had so much information, and he was wrong about a few things, but it's taken us so long to catch up. But maybe you can kind of just weave that in.
I'll start saying something about Freud by, first of all, going back to what you were saying about your own experience of various substances. I think that's it's a very useful exercise for anybody interested in the life of the mind to try. I don't mean in a wild and unregulated, unsupervised way, but I have systematically, without knowing what I was taking, regulated by my assistant, who kept a record of what I was taking. I took various neuromodulators in order to experience myself. What is it like to boost dopamine, to block dopamine, to boost noradrenaline, to block noradrenaline, and acetylcholine, as you mentioned. And that by itself would be, I think, should be enough to persuade my colleagues, if only they would take these substances, which are manipulating the neuromodulators, as I said earlier, that are sourced in the reticular activating system. It should be enough to persuade them the reticular activating system is a pretty affective place. But so I'm saying it's a good exercise to try these things out yourself. And Freud did that. Freud in the 1880s had a penchant for cocaine.
DRI. But that's very addictive, because something like an SSRI, you might have incredible a sensation of empathy that you wouldn't feel in normal life, whereas you could go to a bad place. It's called wireheading, isn't it, where your regulatory system short circuits and you develop all sorts of very strange behaviors. So some people have a higher susceptibility to addiction as well, but maybe is that what?
Well, when Freud started dabbling with cocaine, it was really the very beginning of it being introduced into European medicine. So it's the risks associated with imbibing cocaine were not well established, and in fact, it was pretty soon after Freud started recommending cocaine that, in fact, tragically, he recommended it as a agent to assist withdrawal from morphine addiction. All that it did was turn morphine addicts into cocaine addicts, or both. So he did retreat from that. But why I mention Freud, I mean, he admitted his error, But why I mention Freud's having imbibed cocaine is because I think that just as with me, taking these drugs gives me a direct personal experience of, something about how my brain works, and what are the neural correlates of these affective experiences. I think that Freud, from the personal experience of what it is like to boost dopamine via cocaine, came to recognize that there's this powerful, motivational, pleasurable urge, in all of us, which he called libido. I think that his confident belief that there was a kind of basic drive that was this energetic, enthusiastic, pleasure-seeking urge that he called libido. I think that it partly came from his own personal experience with cocaine. But having said all of that, and why I'm saying all of that is because you were talking about brain mechanisms of dreaming, and you mentioned acetylcholine. So my earliest research, in fact, this is what made me interested in Freud in the first place. In my earliest research, which had nothing to do with Freud, it had to do with brain mechanisms of sleep and dreaming. We knew at the time that I did this research, which I started in the mid-1980s, we knew that REM sleep is driven by acetylcholine, and we know it's driven by mesopontine acetylcholine. It's a certain part of the brain stem where this cholinergic arousal originates. And so I was very surprised to find in my patients, because I studied not rats but human beings who can speak, and I had 18 patients with damage to that part of the brain stem who lost REM sleep and yet continued to dream. So that was a big surprise, that the brain mechanism that generates REM sleep, the cholinergic brain mechanism that generates REM sleep, evidently can't be the mechanism that generates dreams, because when you knock it out, dreams continue. And then alongside that, I observed that damage to another part of the brain, which was not cholinergic but rather dopaminergic, and this is why I mentioned dopamine, a system called the mesocortical mesolimbic dopamine system. Damage along that pathway, which originates in a different part of the brainstem called the ventral tegmental area. Damage there leads to loss of dreaming with preservation of REM sleep. So there we had a double dissociation. One system knocks out REM sleep but spares dreaming. The other system knocks out dreaming but spares REM sleep. What that shows us is that REM sleep and dreaming cannot be the same thing.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. I was really interested in that part of the book, and maybe there might also be other ways of damaging the dopaminergic system, like with amphetamines or just dopamine agonists, for example. But we're a little bit short on time, so I just wanted to finish off with behaviorism. So you spend a lot of time lambasting behaviorism, and it's this idea basically that we should treat intelligent things as simple impulse response automata. So they're not thinking, they're not planning. And this gripped the world of cognitive science and psychology for a very long time, and it was also related to this cognitivism thing, which didn't take affect into account at all. Chomsky, who we've had on the show, he famously put that paper against B.F. Skinner, I think, and it was around 1956. But what are your thoughts on behaviorism, and how has it informed your views on cognition?
I think that the origin of the behaviorist movement, the impetus that gave rise to it, is very important. It's very important for us to be clear about this. It is the subjective nature of the mind. The mind is first and foremost something subjective. You can only experience your own. And this is an embarrassment to science. So Freud's view was science has to adjust its methods to the object that it's studying. For Freud, it simply is part of nature. Experiences clearly exist. They are subjective, unfortunately. But, you can't say we're going to exclude these things because they're hard to study. You got to say, well, they exist. How can we study them? The behaviorists took the former view. They said, we're going to exclude these things because they're hard to study. So the behaviorist tradition began actually as a methodological strategy, or I suppose one could even elevate it to an epistemological strategy, that they were saying, because we can't study subjective states objectively, we're going to exclude subjective states, and we're going to study only their objective manifestations, in other words, behaviors. So we'll study the objective stimuli that provoke the behavior, and we'll study the objective response, in other words, the behavior itself, but we won't study what goes on between those two things, because all of that's in a black box that called subjectivity that is out of bounds. I need to make explicit what that meant was they excluded the psyche from psychology. I mean, what could be more absurd? In the science of the mind, we must leave out the mind because it's hard to study. But that's what they did. But they went a step further than that. It then became not only that we cannot study these subjective states, they went on to say subjective states don't exist, that this is a fiction. I remember, I can't quote it chapter and verse, but I can paraphrase something that Skinner said along the lines of emotions, in inverted commas, are an excellent example of the fictions that we use, that we invoke to explain behavior. I mean, how anybody can think that emotions are fictions and to have lived a life is beyond me. So that's what happened. Behaviorism was a blight on psychology, and it's still not gone completely,
Well, could I touch on that? Because I agree it's still not gone completely. I interviewed Nick Chater. He wrote the book called The Mind is Flat, and he's a connectionist. And actually, a lot of folks in the neural network world now, they do have this behaviorist view, in my opinion. So they say the brain is an inscrutable mess, and we adopt a stance. So it's a kind of instrumental fiction, or it's an illusion. I guess you could also kind of link it to Daniel Dennett's illusionism in a way. So what we do is we share sophisticated behavior, and they say the only public thing is the behavior. So why talk about a secret realm? We share information, and we adopt a stance, and we create this kind of psychological model of what's going on. But it may as well be a fiction. And I think of that as being intellectually dead, but it's very predominant in the world of neural networks and AI right now.
Yeah, and indeed in cognitive science, I'm afraid to say, it's a cognitive science is a darn sight better than behaviorism, in that at least it acknowledges that there is something going on between your ears. That's causally contributing to what comes out the other side. It's not just a stimulus passive mediation through learning and then response, that there is an active mental process going on. But still, when you speak to cognitive scientists about the subjective being of that apparatus, that device, that information processing flowchart that they point to, when you say, but where is the subject in there that's receiving this information, and why? They look at you as if you crawled out of cheese, because this is not the right sort of question for them. So I think that I would go back to Descartes and say that the one thing I can know for sure is that I have experience. It is absolutely ludicrous to start with the opposite and say, well, there is this mysterious and private and invisible realm called experience. So let's leave that out. It's not invisible. I'm experiencing it right now. I have the most direct empirical access to it. So for me, to leave it out is crazy. It's crazy. Yeah. And there are so many things I want to say to you in relation to what you've just said. So let me just try and get as many of them in under the wire as I can. The first is, because we know that we feel like something, for me the question becomes, why do we feel? And I've already explained to you in our very interesting conversation today why I think certain kinds of systems need to feel. There's a mechanistic causal imperative for them to feel how well or badly they're doing in terms of their self-organizational in other words, existential goals. I think that that's enough for me. If I know that we feel, and I have a perfectly reasonable causal account as to why this should happen, why certain systems have feelings. And why I'm saying that is because it's very important to recognize for these people who are saying all we need to look at is the behaviors, is that the way that such a system behaves is because it feels. The feelings actually do something. The feelings have causal consequences. If you leave out the feelings, you're never going to understand how such a system works and why it does what it does and why it can do what it does. And there's a lot more that could be said down that road, but let me just make sure that I've got the essence of it clear. I believe that you will never understand how the brain works if you leave out of account the fact that the brain, unlike anything else in the known universe, feels like something, and that those feelings have consequences for what the brain does. That's the main point I wanted to get through there.
Just very final question, because my Discord community would be aghast if I didn't ask this, but if you can do it very, very quickly. But other grand theories of consciousness. I know you're not a huge fan of Tononi's IIT, which reduces consciousness to a scalar. There's the Bernard Bars global workspace theory, but in particular, one of our members wanted you to comment on Graziano's attention schema theory, which is if yours is a homeostatic system of affect, I think you could argue that Graziano's system is a kind of similar system of attention. What's your take on his theory?
I think that you can either try to draw as sharp a division between your own theory and everybody else's as you can, or you can acknowledge where the commonalities and overlaps are. And I prefer to take that second approach. Yep. So even IIT, I'm not a fan of IIT because I think that it reifies information in the same way as Chalmers did in that old paper of his. As if it's a thing, I ask of Tononi again, who for whom is this integrated or otherwise information? What purpose is it serving? That's the question. But to say that fundamentally consciousness arises from a certain kind of information processing, that's where I overlap with him. Yes. With Bars and his successors, Global Workspace. What I have against it is it's cortico-centric. I have a patient, I reported him in my book, who has absolutely no prefrontal cortex and is perfectly conscious and even has a sense of humor about it. So I think that that's what's wrong with that theory. However, I think that what is igniting that and sustaining that global integrated reverberative activation in cortex is underlying arousal systems. So I think that you can see where the global workspace comes from. It does exist, but to me, what sustains the workspace is underlying arousal mechanisms. So that's where I overlap with them. When it comes to attention control theory, I think exactly as you have just said, affect is the grandparent of attention. Attention is not something that is neutrally and randomly deployed. It's something that's deployed on the basis of salience, whether it be exogenous or endogenous attention. And we haven't spoken at this level of mechanism in our conversation today, but the mechanism underpinning attention is precision modulation. And I believe that is the mechanism of affect. You spoke much earlier in our conversation today about prediction errors, I was thinking as you were saying that, well, we must remember it's not only prediction errors, it's precise prediction errors that matter. As the agent loses confidence in its outgoing predictive policies, that's bad from the point of view of the agent. And as it gains confidence in the incoming error signal, that's bad. So I like to put it like this. If things are turning out as expected, that's good. If uncertainty prevails, that's bad. In other words, as I lose confidence in my generative model, that's a bad state to be in. So that's what I mean when I say precision modulation underpins affect. And so there's a deep continuity between affect and attention, right down to the level of the underlying statistical mechanics.
Yeah, indeed. And of course, there's a precision and recall thing, but also, I mean, we haven't got time to go into this, but Friston's formalism balances, kind of exploitation and exploration. So even though we were saying a perfect system would be completely stable, the formalism actually naturally kind of encompasses keeping a little bit of entropy around so that I can still discover other interesting
In affective neuroscience, where we study these arousal systems in great depth, one of them, in fact, the one that I mentioned when we were talking about dreams, the mesocortical, mesolimbic dopamine system, what Jaak Panksepp calls the seeking system, and Berridge calls it the wanting system, and most neuroscientists call it the brain reward system. It works exactly like that. It's an exploration system, not an exploitation system. And what we've come to understand, or what I think we are coming to understand about that system, is that it too, of course, is a homeostatic system, but in a very interesting way. It engages with uncertainty. In other words, its homeostatic set point is engage with uncertainty. This is where I need to be. And if you think about it, it's kind of straightforward that positively engaging with uncertainty, wanting novelty, seeking novelty, all that it does is it proactively reduces uncertainty in the long run. The more that you engage with what's not known now, you're interested in what's not known, the more will be known in future. So in the long run, it functions according to the same negentropic principle as all the other homeostats do.
Yes, you said the seeking system was actually the default affect system, which is amazing. Anyway, folks at home, you have to read Professor Solms' book. I've genuinely really, really enjoyed it. It's beautifully written. The Audible version is read out by a chap with a British accent and quintessentially British, a bit like Friston, actually. I enjoyed listening to it. Professor Solms, it's been an absolute honour. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. I've enjoyed our conversation a great deal. Thank you.
Amazing.